do you think of when you hear the word prison? Most Americans see locked cells and grim buildings surrounded by barbed wire. For most of the 2 million individuals confined to prisons and jails across our country, that's not far from reality. Politicians on all sides of the political spectrum have started discussing dramatic changes to the mass incarceration model that has turned us into, over the past several decades, the world's largest jailer. Nearly everyone now agrees it's a model that has left ruined lives and communities in its wake, as well as wasted taxpayer money. But when we look for ways to do better, our attention rarely goes beyond our own borders. Our guest today on Criminal Justice Matters believes there's a lot to be learned from other countries. She spent more than a year visiting prisons in places like Rwanda, Brazil, Thailand, and Norway, and she put her conclusions into one of the year's most interesting books, Incarceration Nations, A Journey to Justice in Prisons Around the World. Baz Dresinger is an associate professor of John Jay College, a journalist and film producer, and the founder of the Prison to College Pipeline. Baz, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful book. It's a
Thank
gripping
you.
read, I think, and I don't usually say this in these programs, but it's something I recommend really everybody read.
Thank you.
Let's start with a title, Incarceration Nations, and then you have, which is difficult to say, and you say, A Journey to Justice in Prisons Around the World. What did you mean by that? What are you trying to achieve?
Well, for one, I wanted the word journey in there because I wanted it to be clear that by reading this book, you're really going on a journey with me, and I'm carrying you to different countries to take a look at their prison systems. And also, I mean, I call it a journey to justice because that's the big question at the heart of the book is what does justice look like, and can you find it? And it's sort of a rhetorical question, can you find it in a prison? Most of the time the answer to that is no, but it's all about, it's a quest book at its core, and it's about the quest for justice.
Did you find it?
In various forms, not in justice incarnate as a big entity, but I found slivers of things that I thought were justice, and some bigger than others, and that if we put them together, we can create a picture of what justice is.
Most Americans don't even think about prisons, much less prisoners. Was your audience, you think, people who really don't think about prisons at all? I mean, or were they, this is not a dry criminological treatise.
Mm-hmm.
This is a diary. It's a very emotional work.
Mm-hmm.
But what did you think of when you thought of your readers, the people that you wanted to convince or persuade?
So I think there are more people thinking about prisons now than there were even 5 years ago, given how popular the topic is and mass incarceration being a front page news issue. But I wanted to reach a really broad audience that is smart and interested in issues, broadly speaking, and interested in what's happening in the world, and interested in thinking about our ideas of justice, but wouldn't necessarily have prison at the forefront of their minds, and don't necessarily have family members or dear friends who are incarcerated. And that was why I wrote the book the way I did.
Tell us a little bit about what you found. I mean, prisons are prisons, aren't they? I mean, prison in one place in the world, it's meant to hold people who've committed crimes or offenses. How can they be that different?
They are quite similar in chilling ways, actually, because they're all pretty much imitative of an American model in most of the countries I visited. So
you actually say that we exported the model everywhere in the world, and they built on that.
we did. We enacted rather the first 2 modern prisons, and then versions of that got exported around the world by way of colonialism and globalization. And so to me, one of the most chilling, depressing things was to be in a country like Brazil or Uganda and see some version of the American structure just enacted on their shores.
What did you find? What were the most interesting things that you found? The interesting prisons or interesting countries that you found?
I think every country is interesting, and I always say I could have gone to every country in the world and found something riveting, because I think the way that we deal with people in prisons is so indicative of the culture at large. It's always a fascinating thing. But I think the thing that was most inspiring and most interesting was finding the pockets of progressive thinking in places where you least expect it.
Such as?
Singapore. Singapore, you find...
You can't chew gum on the street.
You can't, and it's horrifically draconian, and there's caning, and there's all manner of appalling approaches to punishment and crime and justice there. But there's also a particular reentry program designed for people coming home from prison that's enormously progressive and effective at finding people jobs, at promoting acceptance of formerly incarcerated people, at creating an ad campaign of acceptance of formerly incarcerated people. That's surprising and something that we might be able to learn from.
And one of the more interesting prisons or countries that you visited, Incarceration Nations, that you saw was Norway. I'm surprised you don't mention that as one of the one that has the biggest potential for us.
Well, it definitely does. I think I
don't
bring up Norway right away because I think everyone is sort of looking at Norway now, which is great. It's quite wonderful because Norway is doing a lot of things right. I went to 2 prisons in Norway. I went to a very famous open prison called Bastøy. It's a nature reserve island where people in prison can come and go and have the freedom to have jobs and be connected with communities. And it's a pretty idyllic, incredible place that's actually featured in Michael Moore's new documentary. In fact, the warden, who I'm still in touch with, they call him the governor there, let me know recently, we're in touch by email, and he let me know that we're getting tons of American visitors, he said. Everyone wants to come out and see us. And I said, well, great, that's a good thing. But I also went to a more traditional prison in Norway that had a wall, but yet was called, in some way, it's sometimes called the IKEA prison because the conditions are so incredible. It's very beautiful. There's tons of rehabilitative programming going on.
But still, for all of its successes, it's a homogenous society. Not anything like ours, which is multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. I mean, that makes it a little bit more difficult to develop a prison that mirrors what we'd like to see in justice.
Yeah, every country is unique. I didn't write this book thinking, like, let's find the one and then imitate it. But I think it's more about what's applicable from that system to ours. And the idea of an open prison, which is not only used in Norway, it's used in other countries, primarily in Europe. The idea of an open prison can be possibly applicable here. What they call the Norwegian principle of normality, which is that when you're in prison, you're still connected to your community. You're still receiving the same social resources as you were before you went to prison. The idea of a staff training that's grounded in philosophy, law, social work, and psychology instead of criminology and military training. Those are applicable, I think, across the board.
I want to get to the staff in a second, but tell us a little bit about how you got into these prisons. I mean, you were a John Jay professor, so they recognize that. They recognize John Jay's position in the world of criminology. But how difficult was it to actually get what you wanted to get in terms of seeing prisoners and speaking with them frankly and candidly? You say some very interesting things about at some point you felt like you were part of a show, part of a theater, which the prisoners were themselves.
Right. It depended on the country. In a place like Singapore, which is where there's an extraordinary amount of government control, I wasn't able to have free access. So I was a guest of the government, and that was, at times, it felt like absolutely a performance. But most of the time I worked with NGOs, and the NGOs were kind of a backdoor into the prison. They were doing all kinds of work, officially sanctioned, but often what they were doing is flying under the radar.
And they knew about your program, the Prison to College Pipeline here at John Jay.
Yes, and all the time when I reached out, I mean, certainly, as you said, John Jay's name goes a long way, but having been grounded in doing the work in prisons here, people are also interested in learning from me and hearing about how they might enact the Prison to College Pipeline in one way or another on their shores.
I'm fascinated by your discussion of what happened in Thailand, where at first it sounded like this is a fantastic experience, then you realized you're being brought back as to show the possibilities as part of a theater of what prison could be or what justice could be in Thailand. Did you feel awkward about that or uncomfortable?
I did, but and then I mean I'll say I never thought I'd be in a prison with the Princess of Thailand herself. It was definitely, if not the most surreal moment of my life, one of the most surreal moments.
Tell us about it. What happened?
Well, I had gone out there with another faculty member from John Jay, Lorraine Moeller, who's in drama, who had met the princess when the princess was visiting American prisons, and went to Bedford Hills with her. And she was the one who told me about the princess's NGO, that she has an organization that creates model prisons for women in Thailand, and that she's deeply invested in the issue of incarcerated women in Thailand and also globally. So I reached out to them. Lorraine had put me in touch with them, and we ended up going out together to lead a drama workshop. We were part of this whole delegation of people who do different kinds of work in prison. So there was drama, there was yoga, there was narrative, what was called narrative therapy. And it was all a very intense and beautiful experience where we got to visit the model prisons and lead these workshops. But I think the really surreal experience happened when, after that, they ended up flying us all back for another event a few months later with the princess at the hub of her model prison system at the prison called Ratchaburi, and we held a conference there, and some of the people, the women, incarcerated women, performed, and the princess gave me a pin, and I had to practice my bow, and it was all certainly this grand performance, and that I found out afterward. I mean, I sussed it out even when I was there. Obviously, this is like a PR stint, but the thing that I conclude is that just because it's a PR stint doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. The power of the princess being in the prison and it being the big headline all over Thailand for a week is that it suddenly makes people look at what's happening in prisons and kind of focus on a place that they might not otherwise even look at.
There's a lesson for us in that as well. President Obama did something of the same thing this year when he went to the prison.
Yes, PR is deep.
Yeah.
I mean, it's about getting people to think about this issue differently, think about the people in prison differently, and frankly, just think about prison at all.
Let's talk a little bit about prison in general. A big part of your book, or at least some of the subtext of what you talk about, is raising questions about what prisons are for and whether they're a legacy of a model of punishment or rehabilitation that doesn't work anymore. Now, are you suggesting that we need to think beyond prisons, or that prisons themselves as an institution don't work?
I'm absolutely suggesting that. I don't think that prisons as the exclusive response for dealing with crime, which is essentially what we do now, works. And I think recidivism rates on a basic level say that, right? 60-something% recidivism rate indicates that this is not working. But I think overall, prisons are not morally effective, they're not socially effective, they're not economically effective. They need to be rethought altogether. And there are other paradigms for thinking about crime and justice.
It's a hard thing for most Americans, I think, to understand. When they think about prisons, when we think about prisons, we think about the crime that brought people there. We think, well, that's the place to put them. We don't want them in the society. If they can be rehabilitated, fine. But prisoners themselves are a group that we really don't want to have much to do with. But you actually, in your career, in your professional life, but in this book, you met a lot of prisoners and turned them into individuals. What can you tell us about some of the faces and the stories that you encountered?
Well, I'm glad you say that, because that's really what I wanted to do most of all with the book, was just give an opportunity for this population to be humanized and for people to meet and confront and experience the people behind bars in the way that I've been able to, both here and globally. And I think people don't recognize, number one, just how brilliant this population is and what their capacities are and how much they could be contributing to society, and how much we're missing out on by warehousing them away. And I think that's critically important. And I think the other thing that people don't realize is how the line between us and them is a lot thinner than they'd like to believe, that we could be in their shoes a lot more easily if our circumstances were different.
Sort of like prisons are us.
Absolutely.
Let's look at the other side of that. The other group of people who have most connection with prisons are the guards, the jailers. You met a lot of jailers and guards over the process of doing this book. Did you learn anything interesting about them and what their roles, or potentially their roles, could be in a more enlightened rehabilitation correction system?
Well, I saw there what I see on these shores often, which is that they are doing time alongside the people they're incarcerated most of the time. They are not so happy in their jobs. The conditions are pretty awful and inhumane. And I always think about I think about Frederick Douglass, the famous slave narrative, and how the picture that he paints there is of the fact that slavery dehumanizes the slave and the master both. And I think the same is true about prisons. It's an ugly institution. It's a dehumanizing institution. And so it's going to impact both the people with the power and without the power. And there are certainly well-meaning corrections officers all over the world. But unfortunately, to stay that way, given the conditions of the job, is inordinately difficult.
And what would you suggest? I mean, what do jailers or guards in other places do or provide that we don't hear in the US?
Well, for one, getting to Norway, I went to the Staff Training Academy and got to meet with the head of staff training and learned, as I said, that they're trained in altogether, they're pooling from a very different population. And you have to be educated. It's a very competitive job, and it pays well, and it's a very well-respected job. So we want to think about who we're recruiting for this. And because they have the freedom to actually develop real relationships, relations was a word that I heard echoed throughout the Norwegian system in terms of developing relationships between staff and between corrections officers and staff and prisoners. That's really profound because it allows you to be a human being in your workplace. And I saw this in Rwanda too. I mean, I saw the opposite of it in many places, including the male prisons. I went to one male prison in Thailand, and the officers were absolutely suffering and felt like their life was at risk every single day, given the system.
You got a glowing review from Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow. But one of the things she said, speaking of the way you looked at some of the prisons, was she raised doubts about how you portray the prisons in Australia, which are run by private corporations. And she felt that you glossed over some of the inequities and the other problems that come with private prisons. We've seen those problems here in the U.S. What do you think of that? I mean, did you look at it too superficially, or are you saying that private prisons are a potential alternative to the way we run things?
I'm definitely not saying that private prisons are an alternative. I mean, for the record, private prisons are evil. The way that they are, the way that private prisons are run is absolutely absolutely an evil, because they are given enormous control of the legislature. They are a money-making industry. It's clear to me that this is a problem, and I express that very, very clearly in the book. And the other thing that I'm clear about when it comes to the Australia chapter are the racial inequities of the system, which is deeply embedded in what I write in that chapter. The fact that the Aboriginal populations are historically have been and continue to be incarcerated at obscene rates that skyrocket even beyond the rates for Black and brown folk in America. So I'm pretty confident those issues are not glossed over. But I think the thing that I do experience in Australia are two private prisons in which progress seems to be happening, in which there are progressive people working, there are alternative approaches. And what I heard again and again was that happens because there's a lot less red tape, because it's a private company, so they can get away with more. Now, the implications of that are complex. That doesn't mean, therefore we should privatize the industry. It just means that private prisons aren't necessarily the convenient devil that we often talk about them as. And the state system is implicated here too. It's all one big sort of capitalistic entity. And I think when we address it, we should address it together.
So changing prisons is a big job. We have to start somewhere. Where would you start in the U.S.? What would be the first thing that you would recommend that we do if you're a local legislator, a municipal authority, or even the federal government? What's the first thing we need to do if we're going to start changing the way we approach prison, justice, and crime?
I think you've got to do some immediate cleanup stuff, which is abolish solitary altogether. I went to a federal supermax in Brazil. I've, of course, through students and incarcerated friends, heard much about solitary on our shores. But solitary needs to go across the board, not just for juveniles, not just in federal prisons, but across the board. We have to come up with other punitive measures and other ways of creating community. Restore access to education. Pell Grants and federal and state financial aid so that education programs are flourishing. This is all, and both of these are not tremendously difficult to do. We need a task force that's looking at all of the innovative programs. I mean, I tried to do that in this book to some extent globally, but this is a drop in the bucket. We need to look at alternatives to incarceration that are working in a really coherent, serious way and start thinking bigger. And then fundamentally, this is more big picture and long-term thinking, but we have to funnel lots of money into restorative justice programs.
So this is a great time to be talking about this because we're all talking about changing prisons, changing criminal justice in itself. What reaction have you got so far? Have you got anything from legislators, from prison guards, and where's it coming from?
I haven't gotten any legislative response as yet, other than individual people that I've worked with who've read it and told me they liked it. But I have been getting emails from all over the world from people who are in prison. Either they have a loved one in prison or they spent time in prison, who tell me. I've heard from many of the characters in the book who felt proud of how I represented them, which was the most important thing to me.
Is anybody on the campaign trail listening to you? Did you hear from Hillary or from
No, but
Donald Trump,
I will happily send them my cell phone number. So give me a call, Bernie. When Bernie talks about abolishing private prisons, that's music to my ears, but I'd like to hear some more. So call me, Bernie. We'll talk.
Baz, thanks very much. It's great. We could go on for another hour, I think, but I recommend everybody to read your book.
Thank you.
Fantastic read.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Americans, as a rule, think we have little to learn about the way other countries do things. I guess it's a matter of national pride. But when it comes to our system of punishment, we have little to be proud of. Countless studies have shown that most individuals in our prisons return to their communities bitter and ill-equipped to adjust to life on the outside. And, no surprise, many find themselves back behind bars for new offenses within a few years. That's hardly a recipe for public safety. If we're as serious about rehabilitation as we are about punishment, examining the successes of other nations would be a sign of strength, not weakness. That makes sense to me. I hope it does to you as well. I'm Steve Handelman. Thanks for watching. See you next time.